Russell Baines had never thought of his driveway as anything more than a strip of cracked asphalt that kept his truck from sinking into the spring mud. It wound lazily from the county road to his small house, a modest place tucked behind a line of cedar trees that had grown wild since the 70s. When his uncle leased him the property 3 years earlier, the road had been the one part Russell promised to maintain himself. He patched it, sealed it, even planted ryegrass along the edges so the dirt wouldn't wash away. It wasn't beautiful, but it was his. Solid proof that something in his unpredictable life could be managed with his own 2 hands. Most mornings began the same way. He'd start his old pickup, pull the coffee trailer hitched behind it, and drive down that uneven strip toward town. The smell of fuel, damp soil, and bitter roast meant stability, even if the profit margins didn't. The neighborhood around him had changed in those 3 years. What had once been empty lots and tree lines now sprouted rows of near-identical beige houses, each with manicured lawns and flagpoles gleaming like uniformed soldiers. A homeowners association had followed soon after, appearing quietly but spreading quickly, like ivy taking over a wall. They sent newsletters filled with smiling faces, invitations to community breakfasts, and lists of newly adopted regulations, none of which applied to Russell's land. He wasn't one of them, didn't pay their dues, and didn't attend their meetings. He stayed invisible, or so he thought. It started with a note left on his windshield one morning, printed on crisp paper bearing a gold seal. Notice of boundary violation, it read. The message was polite, almost apologetic, informing him that his driveway extended beyond the approved perimeter of the development, and that corrective measures were to be undertaken within 30 days. At first he laughed. The driveway had been there long before the HOA existed. He tossed the letter onto the passenger seat and forgot about it, until the next week, when a second notice arrived by certified mail, this time referencing fines, measurements, and community adjustments. What unsettled him wasn't the bureaucracy, it was the precision. The measurements matched the exact length of his driveway, down to the foot, as if someone had walked it, clipboard in hand, while he was away. He started noticing small details that made him uneasy. White spray-painted dots along the gravel shoulder, a surveyor's flag pinned into the soil, a drone that hovered one morning just long enough for him to look up and feel foolish for doing so. Russell asked around, casually at first, but no one seemed to know who ran the HOA. The residents deferred to vague committees and property managers whose names changed from month to month. When he finally stopped one of the men in an HOA jacket inspecting mailboxes, the man only said, "We're regularizing access routes, sir," and walked away before Russell could ask what that meant. That evening, as the last light fell behind the cedars, he stood at the edge of his driveway and noticed how the main HOA road curved slightly onto his land before looping back toward their subdivision. He crouched, dragging his finger along the cracked asphalt, and realized there was a faint, almost hidden groove in the surface, like a buried marker line. Something had been drawn here long ago, and everyone else had chosen to ignore it. In that moment, with dusk turning the road into a black ribbon vanishing under the trees, Russell felt an old instinct stirring, the quiet, stubborn certainty that someone had just stepped over a line that wasn't meant to be crossed. The second notice should have been enough to make Russell angry, but instead it made him curious, and curiosity in a place like Maple Hollow was often more dangerous than defiance. 2 mornings after receiving the certified envelope, he found a row of orange cones set across the first 10 feet of his driveway. There was no vehicle nearby, no workers, just the cones and a laminated sign, cable tied to a stick that read, "Pending boundary adjustment. Do not remove." The wording was bureaucratic, but carried an air of finality, as if a decision had already been made somewhere far above him. He moved the cones aside, drove through them, and went about his day selling coffee near the courthouse downtown. But the image gnawed at him. When he returned that evening, the cones were back, neater this time, positioned exactly where he'd found them in the morning, their bases pressed into the asphalt like someone had made a point of setting them firmly. That night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of leftover brew gone cold, He searched the county database for anything mentioning boundary adjustment. Nothing relevant appeared. What did appear, though, was a scanned subdivision plat from 1979 that labeled his entire driveway as access easement, non-transferable, retained by Bain family. He frowned. He had no HOA connection. His property wasn't even listed within their jurisdictional overlay. The only link between his parcel and theirs was a thin gray line marked Temporary Utility Corridor, running straight through what was now their main boulevard. The following morning, a white SUV idled at the mouth of his driveway. A woman in a navy blazer and sunglasses stepped out, holding a clipboard and a roll of survey tape. She didn't look at him when he approached, only asked if he was Mr. Baines. When he said yes, she smiled with the kind of polite superiority that belonged to people who never expected to be questioned. "We're verifying perimeter consistency," she said. "Routine." Then she began measuring from the edge of his mailbox toward the cedar line, jotting notes while murmuring to herself. When Russell asked who she worked for, she responded simply, "Community Management Division," before getting into her vehicle and leaving. The words weren't the name of any HOA he'd heard of, nor were they a county department. He checked later. No such division existed locally. By the weekend, things escalated. A backhoe appeared early Saturday morning, its operator claiming he'd been hired by the association to install drainage culverts along the shared edge. Russell stood in front of the machine until the man shut it down. "You got the wrong address," he said. The operator shrugged and handed him a printed work order with coordinates that matched perfectly his coordinates. At the bottom of the page was a faded logo he recognized from the HOA letters, a golden crest with the initials MHA, Maple Hollow Association. That same afternoon, Russell drove to their office listed on the letterhead, a polished suite inside a glass-fronted building on the edge of town. The receptionist gave him a professional smile, but froze slightly when he mentioned the driveway order. She stepped into a back room, whispered to someone, and returned with a middle-aged man in a gray vest who introduced himself as Property Compliance Liaison. He listened to Russell's story without taking notes, and finally said, "Sir, your driveway exceeds the allowable length under Section 4B of the Access Regulations. It obstructs the continuation of planned improvements. We need to bring it back within prescribed limits." When Russell pointed out that his property wasn't under HOA authority, the man's tone cooled. All properties connecting directly to Maple Hollow roads are subject to review. It's a matter of continuity. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "Voluntary compliance is always preferable. It keeps everyone's record clean." That night, Russell couldn't shake the phrase, voluntary compliance. It carried the flavor of a threat delivered through a smile. He walked the full stretch of the driveway with a flashlight, counting each reflective marker that had appeared since morning. 12 in total, evenly spaced along the right-hand edge. When he bent down to touch one, he realized it wasn't just a marker. A thin metal rod connected it to the ground, and beneath the gravel was a sensor pad no bigger than his hand. Someone had embedded monitoring equipment along his drive. He pulled one out, the wire snapping free with a metallic click, and pocketed it. Under the beam of his flashlight, he saw faint tire impressions near the edge of the cedar grove, leading toward the HOA road. They weren't his tires. The next day, his cousin, who handled the land lease paperwork, called him in a hushed voice. "You got people asking for access records," she said. "Said they're verifying easements for municipal review. They wanted to know if you'd ever filed a relinquishment." Russell felt a pulse in his neck. "Relinquishment of what?" "Your access rights," she said. "But here's the weird part. They already had a draft copy with your signature on it, dated last year." He swore quietly, thanked her, and hung up. He hadn't signed anything of the sort. He drove straight to the county recorder's office, demanding to see the document. The clerk printed it, her expression uncertain. The signature looked eerily accurate, but the witness section was blank, and the notary seal was smudged, barely legible. The filing date corresponded exactly with the HOA's formation date. That evening, As he turned off the main road and saw the cones still waiting, he realized how meticulously this had been orchestrated. It wasn't a clerical error or an overzealous committee. It was a coordinated attempt to shift ownership through exhaustion, make the property owner doubt, pressure him with procedure, bury him under polite paperwork until surrender seemed easier than resistance. Standing in the growing twilight, Russell felt a slow, icy certainty settle in his chest. They weren't trying to shorten his driveway. They were testing how far he'd go before he broke. Russell didn't sleep much after that discovery. The fake signature haunted him more than the notices or the cones, or even the strange sensors buried in his gravel. There was something unnervingly methodical about it all, like each action had been planned to blend just enough bureaucracy with menace to keep him off balance. The next morning, before dawn, he drove into town and met with a surveyor he'd worked with once during his brief stint in construction. The man owed him a favor and agreed to pull the official plats for both parcels, Russell's and the HOA's adjacent tract. They spread the maps across the hood of the truck, steam from their coffee curling between them as the sun began to rise. The results were astonishing. Every road, sidewalk, and cul-de-sac within the HOA's neatly fenced community cut through land still legally tied to Russell's leasehold. On paper, the association had been driving, building, and living atop his family's property for years. The error, buried deep within decades of transfers and unrecorded amendments, had never been corrected. The HOA had effectively built its empire on borrowed ground. The surveyor whistled low, shaking his head. "They'll never admit that," he said. "Too much money tied up in it." Russell spent the rest of the day tracing boundaries, using stakes and orange paint to mark the actual legal line. By evening, a jagged trail of neon dots cut directly across the HOA's main boulevard and right through their ornamental sign. He half expected someone to confront him, but the streets stayed silent, curtains drawn tight in those identical houses. Around midnight, as he sat on his porch trying to make sense of the implications, the faint hum of an engine reached him from down the drive. Headlights crawled closer until a black pickup stopped at the cone barrier. Two men stepped out, both wearing reflective vests without logos. One carried a clipboard, the other a flashlight that swept slowly across the trees. Russell called out, but they ignored him, pacing back and forth as if measuring invisible lines. When he approached, the man with the flashlight spoke first. "Sir, you're interfering with community infrastructure. We'll need you to step back." His tone was flat, rehearsed. Russell demanded identification. The clipboard man produced a laminated badge with the Maple Hollow crest and a name he couldn't read in the dim light. Before he could argue further, they climbed back into the truck and drove away, the cones now stacked neatly on the shoulder as though they'd never blocked anything at all. The next morning, he found his paint markers gone. The stakes had been pulled up and tossed into the ditch. Worse, a thin strip of asphalt had been freshly cut and patched overnight, right along the contested line, as if to erase his work under the guise of maintenance. The message was clear. He wasn't supposed to leave marks. Later that afternoon, he returned home to find an envelope taped to his door. Inside was a formal complaint from the Maple Hollow Planning Subcommittee, accusing him of unauthorized alteration of designated right-of-way and demanding removal of hazardous markers. There was no phone number, only an address that led back to the same glass-fronted office downtown. When he called the county office to confirm whether such a subcommittee existed, the clerk hesitated before replying that she had no record of any planning committee under that name. By the end of the week, retaliation became unmistakable. The garbage truck skipped his house twice in a row. His mail arrived opened, resealed with tape. Once he found a pile of dirt dumped directly across the end of his driveway, forcing him to shovel for half an hour just to get out. Neighbors passed by without acknowledging him, eyes sliding away like he was already a ghost. He began documenting everything, photographing cones, letters, even tire tracks, though he knew evidence meant little against an opponent that could manufacture paperwork faster than he could print it. One evening, a delivery driver stopped him on the road, asking if he was the guy fighting the association. When Russell admitted he was, the driver just shook his head and muttered. They did the same to a farmer 2 towns over. He ended up selling. The unease turned into resolve after he noticed something else. On the far end of the subdivision, where the main boulevard met the county road, a new construction site had appeared. The sign read, Phase 2 Expansion, Future Commercial Access. The blueprint depicted an extended roadway, running exactly along his driveway's path. It wasn't about aesthetics or compliance. They were building a new artery for their development, and his land was the missing piece. His boundary violation was simply the first step in acquiring it. Determined to expose them, Russell scheduled a meeting with a local property attorney, an older woman named Linda Fox, who had once represented landowners in a pipeline dispute. After reviewing his documents, she leaned back and sighed. You've got them in a corner legally, she said, but they'll drag you through mud before they admit fault. Expect inspection notices, tax reassessments, maybe even code violations. She was right. Within a week, 2 inspectors showed up claiming they needed to evaluate his septic system due to runoff concerns. The following day, the power company flagged his meter for irregular usage. Each event carried the same stench of coordination. Small disruptions meant to wear him down. Then came the final twist. A certified letter from a title firm he'd never heard of, informing him that his parcel access rights were under administrative review. When he called, the representative explained, almost cheerfully, that the HOA had submitted a petition to have the driveway reclassified as shared infrastructure. Russell laughed, but it wasn't amusement. It was disbelief laced with rage. You can't just reclassify private land, he said. The representative's tone cooled. That's for the board to determine, sir. When he hung up, Russell realized what was happening wasn't just harassment. It was annexation by paperwork. That night he stood again on the cracked asphalt, staring toward the silent rows of houses. The air smelled faintly of tar and cedar, the 2 scents that had defined his life there. He thought about his uncle, about the promise he'd made to keep the place intact. He could almost hear his father's voice, telling him that land isn't just dirt, it's memory. It's the line you draw to remind others you exist. He tightened his jaw, picked up a can of orange paint, and started marking the boundary again, 1 trembling stroke at a time, daring them to come back and erase it again. Russell had reached a point where the rhythm of harassment had almost become predictable, which in itself was more terrifying than the individual events. Each new day brought a slightly different method of pressure, as if someone were testing how much weight he could bear before the structure of his patience collapsed. The orange paint he had sprayed along the property line vanished within 48 hours, replaced by chalk measurements and small wooden stakes hammered in a perfect grid. The subtle precision of those marks chilled him. It was not vandalism or intimidation by amateurs, but something systematic, like an invisible crew operating with authority. When he called Linda, his attorney, she told him calmly to stop touching anything. They're creating a record, she warned. If you interfere, they'll claim obstruction. Let them build their case. It'll only tighten the rope around their own neck. But waiting felt like surrender, and Russell wasn't built for passivity. Each night he walked the road with a flashlight, noting the new changes, the stakes multiplying, a faint metallic hum under the ground that he eventually traced to buried fiber conduits the HOA had quietly installed across the line years ago. He had stepped into a war of patience, and he was already late to it. One morning, his cousin arrived with bad news. The county's digital map had been updated, and now the official boundary line stopped 10 feet short of where it used to. His driveway's last section, the piece that met the main road, had vanished from the parcel registry. The explanation was boundary clarification under Subdivision Alignment Act. When Russell drove to the county office demanding answers, the clerk smiled apologetically and said, "It's a provisional overlay, sir. It can be contested." But the way she said provisional carried the quiet confidence of someone who knew very few ever won such contests. He left the office with copies of both the old and new maps, the contrast so blatant it made his hands shake. They had altered the records without notifying him. It wasn't fraud hidden behind signatures anymore. It was a visible rewriting of geography. That night he met Linda again, showing her the documents. She read them twice, lips pressed into a thin line, then closed the folder. "This isn't just the HOA," she said finally. "Someone in the mapping department is cooperating. There's no other way these revisions could be filed this quickly." Her suggestion was to escalate, to file a formal injunction with the district court. But she also warned him, "Once you do this, you'll be visible. They'll stop playing polite." Russell didn't need convincing. Invisibility hadn't protected him anyway. The next morning, they submitted the injunction, citing unlawful boundary manipulation and unauthorized infrastructure expansion. Within hours of the filing, his phone began ringing with unfamiliar numbers. Contractors asking about right of access, surveyors confirming new road dimensions, even a real estate broker inquiring if he was interested in selling the residual frontage. It was as if the moment he resisted, the network surrounding the HOA came alive, circling him like vultures scenting weakness. 2 days later, while he was hauling supplies for the coffee trailer, he returned to find a temporary fence erected across his driveway. It wasn't heavy, plastic mesh with metal stakes, but it stretched the entire width, marked with bright signage declaring, "Construction Zone, authorized personnel only." A security guard sat idling in a small sedan nearby, and when Russell approached, the man lowered his window and said, "Sir, please keep clear of the active site." "This is my property," Russell snapped. "Your paperwork says otherwise," the guard replied, sliding a folded document toward him through the window. It was an access permit from the county, signed and dated 2 days prior, granting Maple Hollow Association temporary entry for drainage improvements. The signature at the bottom, belonging to some deputy director Russell had never met, looked real enough to pass inspection. He called Linda immediately. She told him to document everything but not to touch the fence. "They want confrontation," she said. "They want you angry on record." The fence stayed for 5 days. During that time, heavy machinery rumbled just beyond the tree line. Russell counted 3 excavators, a cement mixer, and a crew that worked exclusively at night. He couldn't see what they were building, but he could feel the vibrations through the ground like a heartbeat. On the 5th morning, the fence was gone. No signs of construction except a newly paved edge blending perfectly into the HOA road. But when he stepped closer, he noticed small metallic plates embedded in the asphalt, each no larger than a matchbox, and spaced evenly every few feet. He knelt to touch one. It was warm. Later, when he drove over them, his dashboard radio crackled and lost signal for several seconds. He didn't know what kind of technology it was, but instinct told him it wasn't meant for cars like his. The psychological pressure deepened in subtler ways. Neighbors who used to wave now avoided his gaze. Flyers advertising community volunteer days appeared in his mailbox with slogans like, "Keep Maple Hollow safe and accessible." At night, porch lights from nearby homes flicked on in synchronized intervals whenever he stepped outside, as if some unspoken signal traveled among them. Once, while parked at the local grocery store, he returned to find a note under his wiper blade. "You're holding up progress. Roads are for everyone." There was no signature. The combination of precision and pettiness wore on him, the fatigue sinking into his bones. One evening, unable to stand the isolation, he drove through the subdivision, following the curving streets until they merged into what used to be part of his land. Every yard looked immaculate, every garage identical, but the deeper he went, the stranger it felt. The roads had no storm drains, the houses backed against retaining walls built too close to each other for proper code. The entire neighborhood seemed designed for appearance, not longevity. It dawned on him that if the HOA lost even a fraction of the land under dispute, the whole development might collapse in regulatory chaos. They weren't just protecting convenience, they were protecting existence. His driveway was the seam holding together an empire built on negligence. That night, Russell drafted a letter not to the HOA but to the county commissioner, attaching the survey data, the falsified signature, and the revised maps. He mailed it certified, aware it might never reach anyone willing to help. When he returned home, the street was darker than usual. As he parked, he noticed the glow of an unfamiliar vehicle at the far end of the road. Headlights off, engine idling. It stayed there for several minutes before driving away slowly, its taillights disappearing into the curve toward Maple Hollow. The next morning, new cones appeared, this time bright blue, arranged in a perfect semicircle around his mailbox. He stared at them for a long moment, before realizing what truly unnerved him. The cones were clean, brand new, but the asphalt beneath them bore faint tire impressions, his own truck's pattern, repeated precisely, as if copied. Someone had measured his every move, then replicated it. When he met Linda later that week to review the status of the injunction, she looked unusually tense. "They've filed a counterclaim," she said. "They're arguing that your property's existing access road constitutes a safety hazard to the subdivision because it lacks easements for emergency vehicles. They're claiming eminent domain under a community safety clause." Russell's mouth went dry. "Can they do that?" "Not easily," she replied, "but they'll make it look legitimate. They're playing for time." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "You need to understand something. This isn't about you personally. It's about precedent. If you win, it means dozens of similar developments will have to redo their boundaries. That's millions in resurveying costs, maybe lawsuits against the county. They can't afford to lose, so they'll bend reality until you fit the narrative." Driving home that evening, Russell caught his reflection in the window, tired, older, wary. He realized the fight had already changed him. What began as a defense of a driveway had become a battle over ownership of truth itself, over the line between what was real and what could be written into existence. He parked his truck, shut off the lights, and sat in the dark, listening to the faint rumble of construction echoing through the trees. Somewhere beyond that sound, men with clean shirts and perfect signatures were redrawing the world one map at a time, and if he didn't act soon, his piece of it would vanish completely. Russell began to feel the weight of something far larger pressing against him, as if the ground itself were tilting in favor of the association. Every direction he turned seemed to close off in quiet increments. The injunctions stalled in procedural delays, each motion met by a new filing or a missing document request. Linda told him the judge had ordered an evidentiary review that could take months, maybe longer. Meanwhile, Maple Hollow acted as if the case were already decided. One morning, construction signs appeared farther down the road, declaring the start of a community infrastructure upgrade. It was vague enough to mean anything, and official enough to justify anything. The heavy equipment returned, dump trucks, graders, a concrete saw, and within a day they had expanded their pavement another 6 feet onto what remained of his driveway. Russell stood watching from the porch, fists clenched, while workers in orange vests pretended not to see him. The air stank of diesel and hot tar, and every scrape of metal felt like a deliberate insult. He called the sheriff's office, but the deputy who arrived simply shrugged. "They've got a permit," he said. "Looks legitimate. Best talk to your lawyer." That night, Russell went to the site after the crews had left. The moon hung low, turning the new asphalt into a dull silver ribbon that glimmered through the trees. He knelt at the edge, tracing the line where his old driveway met the fresh blacktop. The transition was seamless. They'd blended it perfectly, erasing the physical proof of intrusion. When he drove over it, his truck's tires hissed as if sliding across glass. For the first time, he wondered if fighting them even mattered anymore, if the very idea of ownership had become so fluid that a line on paper outweighed the ground beneath his feet. But resignation wasn't in his nature. He took photos, dozens of them, and emailed everything to Linda before dawn. Her reply was immediate but brief. "Be careful. They're escalating." The following week, letters started arriving daily, each from a different department. One claimed his property was under review for environmental compliance due to potential runoff contamination. Another cited improper commercial activity, referencing his coffee trailer as an unlicensed business on residential land. A third accused him of unauthorized grading for painting boundary marks. The pile on his kitchen table grew until it resembled a paper barricade. Every envelope carried the same emblem embossed in gold, Maple Hollow Association, but the return addresses varied: county offices, independent auditors, regional planning authorities. It was a network of fiction disguised as procedure. Linda assured him that most of it was unenforceable, but she also warned that ignoring them could trigger automatic fines. "They'll bury you in compliance fees," she said. "That's how they win, through exhaustion, not confrontation." By mid-June, the strain began to show. Business at his coffee trailer suffered because he couldn't keep consistent hours. Equipment maintenance bills piled up. Some mornings he woke to find nails scattered across his driveway, sharp enough to puncture his tires, but not obvious enough to report as vandalism. His neighbors avoided eye contact entirely now. Even the kids who used to wave from their bikes rode faster when passing his property, as if afraid to be seen near him. The isolation felt surgical, precise, a slow erasure of his presence. One afternoon, a courier delivered a thick envelope marked "Settlement Proposal." Inside was a letter offering financial compensation in exchange for permanent easement rights and full cooperation with future access plans. The number at the bottom was insulting, not enough to cover legal fees, let alone the loss of his land. But what chilled him was the tone: friendly, reasonable, almost paternal. It promised resolution, peace, and an opportunity to be part of the community again. He tore the letter in half and burned it in the sink. The next day, another copy arrived, identical except for a handwritten note at the bottom. "Think about your daughter." Russell didn't have a daughter, but the implication was clear. They were no longer just testing boundaries of land. They were probing the edges of his fear. He spent that night driving aimlessly through the outskirts of town, trying to shake the claustrophobic feeling that the world had shrunk around him. When he returned near dawn, a new sign had appeared at the entrance to his property. It bore the county logo and the words, "Public Access, Emergency Route." Someone had designated his driveway as a communal right-of-way. He could hardly breathe as he read it, because it meant they had won another invisible battle in some unseen office. The next day, county trucks began marking utility lines along his cedar trees, preparing to install something underground. He confronted the foreman, who looked genuinely uneasy. "We just follow work orders, man," he said. "Came from the regional division, not HOA. But, looks like you're on their map now." The noise and dust became constant. At night, the newly paved section gleamed like an alien scar, and the hum of distant machinery filled the air long after the workers had gone. Russell's world had turned mechanical, every sound a reminder of invasion. Even Linda sounded strained when they spoke. She told him the injunction hearing had been postponed again. Opposing counsel had filed a motion claiming jurisdictional confusion. "They're pushing this into federal review," she said. "It's absurd, but it'll freeze everything for months." He laughed bitterly. "So they get to build while I wait?" "That's the idea," she replied. Late one evening, Russell received a call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was male, calm, measured. "Mr. Baines, we understand your frustration," it said. "No one wants conflict, but resistance only makes things harder, for everyone. You've done well to hold out this long. You can still walk away with something." There was a pause, then the voice added, "You don't want this to reach the next stage." The line went dead before he could respond. He stood in the kitchen staring at the silent phone, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the stillness. Something in the man's tone wasn't threatening exactly. It was confident, the voice of someone who already knew the outcome. The next morning, he woke to the sound of chainsaws. A crew was cutting down his cedars, the trees that framed his home since childhood. When he ran outside, shouting, the foreman handed him a paper, Vegetation Management Order, authorized under the Emergency Access designation. He stood watching as the trees fell one by one, the air filling with the scent of sap and sawdust, and realized he wasn't just losing property anymore. He was losing the landscape of his own history. By the time the last tree hit the ground, the sunlight poured straight through the gap toward the HOA's road, unobstructed for the first time. It looked like an invitation carved into the earth. By July, the fight had consumed every waking thought Russell had, and yet something inside him refused to give them the satisfaction of collapse. The land looked stripped and foreign now, a skeleton of the place he once knew, its quiet replaced by the ceaseless growl of progress. Where his cedars had stood was now a raw, muddy scar bordered by orange mesh fencing and a sign that read, Future Connection Point, Authorized Vehicles Only. He stopped reading the letters that arrived daily because each one said the same thing with a different heading. Compliance required, violation recorded, action pending. He lived surrounded by paper ghosts of a property that, according to half the county's records, no longer belonged to him. Yet every time he stood on that cracked driveway, he could still feel the pulse of ownership beneath the surface, the same stubborn conviction that had carried him through months of deliberate sabotage. The breaking point came quietly. Late one afternoon, he received a call from Linda, her voice tight and low. They moved the hearing, she said. It's happening tomorrow morning, first session. They're claiming you ignored the settlement offers, that you obstructed access improvements. You need to bring every document you have. He stayed up all night organizing boxes of evidence, the maps, photos, copies of falsified permits, even the burnt fragments of the settlement letters he'd kept in a bag. When dawn came, he loaded everything into his truck and drove to the courthouse, a squat brick building that always smelled faintly of mildew and coffee. The hearing was brief, too brief. The HOA's attorney, a smooth man in a navy suit, presented their case with the precision of someone who knew every word would be accepted. He spoke of safety hazards, community integrity, infrastructure standards. Russell tried to interject, to explain that the maps had been altered, that the association's entire road system sat illegally atop his land, but each time the judge cut him off, telling him to wait his turn. When Linda finally stood to speak, she handed over the original plats and pointed to the inconsistencies between them. The courtroom fell silent for a long moment as the judge examined the overlapping boundaries. Then, unexpectedly, the HOA's attorney produced a sealed envelope and slid it across the bench. New evidence, Your Honor, he said smoothly. The judge opened it, read for less than a minute, and nodded. We'll suspend further argument, he announced. Temporary jurisdiction will remain with Maple Hollow pending administrative review. It took Russell several seconds to understand what that meant. The injunction was frozen, the land officially under HOA control until a higher review could be completed, months, maybe years from now. He felt the blood drain from his face as Linda whispered, They filed an emergency management claim, claimed your property's road is part of an evacuation corridor. It overrides civil disputes. He wanted to shout, but no sound came. The judge's gavel struck once, and the hearing was over. Outside the courthouse, the sunlight felt sharp enough to cut skin. Linda tried to speak, but he waved her off, climbed into his truck, and drove home in silence. When he turned onto his driveway, a low rumble stopped him. At the far end, where the asphalt met the main road, a bulldozer idled beside a line of surveyors. They were staking the ground for expansion, extending the boulevard straight through his property. He parked, stepped out, and walked toward them, his boots sinking into the churned earth. The foreman, a large man in a reflective vest, met his eyes briefly, but didn't stop his men. You can't be here, sir, he said mechanically. Russell didn't move. This is my land. The man hesitated, looking genuinely sorry. Not anymore. We got clearance this morning. For a long time, Russell stood there without speaking, the sound of machinery filling the space where his voice should have been. He thought about every document, every late-night phone call, every letter that promised fairness, but delivered quiet destruction. Then he turned away, walking back up the drive that was no longer his, each step sinking deeper into the soft dirt until the noise behind him became just another part of the landscape. That evening, when the crews left, he returned alone. The new section of road gleamed under the fading light, still warm from the day's work. He knelt and pressed his palm against it, feeling the heat seep into his skin. Somewhere beneath that asphalt, beneath the layers of stolen ground and bureaucratic lies, his name still existed in the soil. It wasn't victory, but it was proof. And proof, he realized, was the one thing they could never pave over. Weeks passed after the hearing, and the noise of construction became the new rhythm of Russell's days. The crews worked quickly, erasing the last traces of what his driveway had once been. When they were finished, a smooth stretch of asphalt connected Maple Hollow directly to the county road, lined with brand-new streetlights that burned all night like a boundary carved in light. Officially, the project was celebrated as a community improvement, a small article in the local paper praising the HOA's dedication to safety. Russell's name appeared nowhere, though the reporter had stood on his former property while taking photographs. For a time, he considered moving away entirely, leaving the fight behind. But the thought of vanishing in silence felt worse than losing. He began visiting the courthouse archives every morning, combing through old plats, permits, and handwritten deeds from decades past. It was tedious, but it gave him purpose, a way to stay tethered to what was real. One afternoon, while searching through boxes of microfilm, he found a record that had escaped everyone's attention, a county resolution from 1984 that permanently exempted his parcel from municipal annexation due to a conservation covenant signed by his uncle. The clause was still valid and, if enforced, would void every subsequent modification of the boundary map. He took the document straight to Linda. She read it 3 times, eyes widening slightly. "They buried this," she said quietly. "But if this holds, everything they built on your land becomes illegal infrastructure. It wouldn't restore what was already paved, but it would shift the balance of power." For the first time in months, Russell felt something close to relief. Not triumph, but survival. By autumn, the HOA's construction had halted pending review. The new road remained closed, blocked by orange barriers, a silent monument to arrogance and haste. Russell spent long evenings sitting at the edge of the pavement, where his gravel met their asphalt, the smell of fresh tar fading with the wind. He knew the fight wasn't over. It might never truly end, but the land had memory, and memory, unlike maps, didn't rewrite itself. When the first cold rain came and turned the soil dark again, he felt the ground steady beneath his feet, and for the first time since the cones appeared, he allowed himself to breathe.